morning, everyone, and welcome to Exude Human Capital's webinar series. I'm Alison DiFlorio, and I'm one of your co-hosts for today's program around 5 steps of redesigning performance management. I'm really honored and thrilled to have one of my colleagues, Elaina Van Kirk. Elaina is a principal with our consulting firm and has done quite a bit of work in this space, so I'm sure she's got a lot to share with you. Good morning, Elaina.
Good morning, Allison.
Thanks for being here. And thank you to all of you for taking a few moments of your morning to hear a little bit about what we're seeing in this space. For those of you who have been on our webinars before, you know that these are being recorded. So we will be sending a link out post this session if anyone has the opportunity to share it with someone who perhaps wasn't able to attend, or you want to go back and listen to something that you heard. We welcome that. Your questions, however, are really, really important to us. So we want to make sure that you do use the QA feature throughout the program today. If you have any questions, Elaina and I will do our best to address those questions. However, if we are not able to do that because of time, our contact info will appear on the last slide, and we welcome any of you to reach out to us post this session. And with that said, I'd love, one other quick tip. If you're having any technical challenges, please also let us know that in the QA. And there's a fabulous person behind the scenes, Whitney Beasley, who works the magic to make all of these happen. So she'll help address any concerns we may have there. So before we get into today's session, I would like to formally introduce ourselves. Some of you may have met us on other programs, but I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Exude Human Capital. For those of you who are new to Exude, just a reminder that we consider ourselves a consulting firm around all things people. And what we mean by that is we have 3 practice areas: human resources, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belongingness, and leadership development. And we approach the work at the intersection of the 3 of those because we believe any one of them done in isolation may not have the necessary impact on your organization. My experience as it relates to today's topic, performance management, I've been working with organizations for over 20 years and helping them better align their performance management processes, redesign their actual tools to support your talent strategy, to support your business goals. And I look forward to sharing some insights that I've learned over the years in today's session. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Elaina to share a little bit about her background.
Thanks, Allison. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Elaina Van Kirk. I'm a principal at Exude Human Capital. I have been in the talent management space for 12 years. And most recently, we've been doing a lot of work in supporting organizations in moving away from the traditional approach to performance management and really into some more agile and some more modern approaches of integrating performance management into their talent management lifecycle. So very excited to be with you this morning and share with you some of what we're seeing and what we're doing.
Wonderful. I'm excited to hear some of the things that you're doing too, Elaina, because I hear them in different meetings, but it would be great to hear it in this context. So for today, we're going to talk about some of the trends in performance management that Elaina alluded to. We're going to talk about the steps, specifically 5 steps to be mindful about, to be thinking about if your intention is to redesign your performance management program. Very importantly, we're going to talk about cultural considerations. I think one thing that we see in the work that we do is no 2 organizations are the same. And it's really important that this performance management tool or process has to align to your desired culture. We'll end our session with some tips for you to take away and perhaps to share with the teams that you work with. And we'll certainly allow time for questions and comments. But as I mentioned at the beginning, please feel free to type your questions in and we will get to them as best as we can throughout the program. So what I'd like to do is launch a poll just to set some context for today's program. And whether you just wrapped up your 2022 performance cycle, whether you are beginning to wrap it up because you're on a fiscal year, or whether you're thinking about how do you redefine it for next year. We'd love you to take a moment and answer the following question. How satisfied are you with your current performance management process or tool? You're very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, dissatisfied, or you have come to the conclusion you're completely in need of an overhaul? Just take a minute, answer the poll, and then we'll share the results on the screen. I'm going to give it another couple of seconds here. Whitney can let us know when we are ready to close it. Okay, so this is a nice spread, and we've got, a good number of people are somewhat satisfied, and we've got, over 25% of you are saying, completely in need of an overhaul, and then close to that are dissatisfied. I love to see that some people are very satisfied, and we hope that those individuals will share some of your insights about what's working well and what could be better. So keep this in mind as we work through our session today. We always like to set some context for these programs just by sharing some current data, and these are from various sources you can see at the bottom. But it's interesting, and no surprise, 98% of organizations believe that performance management is important. It certainly is. How else do you keep people aligned to common goals that are going to drive the organization forward, and you keep your team on the right course for them to be successful? But interestingly, 23% of organizations report having frequent performance and goal setting conversations. So that's interesting. That's less than a quarter of organizations reporting that they have frequent performance conversations. We know that about 80% of HR leaders say that they're making changes to performance management, but are unsure of the impact that those changes are going to have. And I think that there's some things we can enter into with a degree of certainty, and then there are other changes that we have to kind of wait and see what the impact's going to be. 80% of employees prefer immediate feedback rather than waiting for an annual review. So if we look at that number and we go back to that, 23% of organizations have frequent performance and goal setting conversations. I also think about that in the context of our I hate to call it the new norm, but our new remote hybrid on-site work environment, whichever one of those you fall into, and how that may have impacted the immediacy of feedback in this virtual world. Around 60% of employees think traditional reviews have no impact on their performance. That's, to me, a concerning number. I don't know how you feel about that one, Elaina, but that's a bit concerning to me. And then 64% of employees think quality of feedback they receive can be improved. And I'll share with you, and I think Elaina will say same. We see that in the work that we do when we go in to evaluate how people currently have their performance management processes structured, and we look at how the feedback is framed, how the written feedback is given, whatever, there are opportunities for that to be improved. Something that we hear, or a few things that we hear that are very consistent across the board. We hear this from employees. We also hear this from managers who are responsible for conducting these reviews, is make it easier, simplify, make it less time consuming, align it to the business. There has to be a clear line of vision so that somebody who's being held accountable to something understands what that means to the overall success of the business, for people to really find it meaningful. The other piece, and I think this is supported by the feedback you just heard, or the stats you just heard, is make it timely and meaningful. Long gone are the days of a once a year performance evaluation. You know, as a business leader, as an HR professional, whatever role you have in an organization, if you're responsible for performance management, ensuring that people get the feedback when they in real time is going to help them be successful and ultimately help your business be successful. So with that context, let's launch into what you need to be thinking about if you're thinking about overhauling or even adjusting. I think it's fair to say, and even in our poll of this group, some of you feel that you're in a pretty good place. Doesn't mean that you have to completely overhaul your performance management tool or process, but it does give you pause. It should give you pause to step back and say, okay, what's working well and what could be better with our current performance management process? And really dig into, get feedback from those who are conducting performance reviews, from those who are receiving performance reviews, as to how they feel about it, and in their experience, any suggestions they may have. Remember, the goal of redesigning a performance management process is really to align people. So it's important to get the voices of the people involved in what's going to change. Why now? I think you have to be very, very clear about why you're going to consider changing your performance management process. Some of the things, and Elaina, you can speak to this, when we engage with organizations around performance management, we'll always ask them, well, where are you in your cycle right now? Because if you're in the middle of a performance cycle, if you're on a fiscal year, whatever you have to be, if you're not going to make any changes to your existing performance year cycle. That may be perceived as unfair because people are being held accountable to something that they didn't realize they were going to be evaluated on. But if you're starting to plan for what's going to happen in the upcoming year, you want to be very clear as the team that's launching this why you're doing it now, why it matters to the business. Maybe you're going to be instituting some sort of technology platform that's going to support your new process. And this is the time for you to redesign the process so that you can make sure that the tool you select is that it's implemented properly and that can support those changes. But really defining the purpose is going to be your first and critical step. Elaina, do you want to add anything to that?
I would, Allison. I think it's really important too, when we think about the purpose, a lot of times we think about the process. But we've also been working with clients, and I challenge you to take a step back and think about culturally in my organization, what is working and what's not working? Do we have a retention problem? Do we have misalignment between employees who are expecting promotions, even though they might not be prepared for that next level role? And so redesigning performance management is that opportunity to reset and reframe those expectations, as well as what those opportunities are for both development and advancement. So taking a step back, looking beyond the process, but what is working, what's not working, why now, and what do we need from this, leads us right into our step 2. So step 2 is clarify your desired outcomes. What are we looking to achieve through performance management? Are we truly looking to influence behavior? Do we need to see improved behavior? Do we need to see improved business results? And so we need more structure around accountability to the behavior and to performance. From your process, what else is that outcome from performance management seeking to inform? Do we need data or metrics in order to align to how we manage compensation? Are we looking to identify development areas for each of our employees? If we're a pay-for-performance organization, what type or what level of performance are we seeking to reward? And we need to make sure that we're then designing a performance process that supports the identification and the differentiation of top performance. So having a sense of what that outcome and the output needs to be will really help inform what goes into it on the front end. If we're looking to identify areas where our employees could use additional development, is it our intention to identify where they're looking to grow, which may or may not be aligned to their current role? Or do we really just want to see how can we support them in being a better employee based on what we know that we need out of them? That's a really important question to ask because it changes how we look at performance management if we're looking at developing the employee only within the context of our organization or the position that they're in now within our organization, or more broadly. Understanding what you need to get out of performance management greatly informs what you need employees and managers to put into it. So it's very common for organizations to want performance reviews to inform how they approach development and succession planning over the next year. But that review process is solely focused on the 1 year in review. So how can we successfully use a process to plan for the future if we're only capturing historical information? We're working with a number of clients to balance that performance review process to capture both backward-looking and forward-looking information, which may include soliciting information on employee career aspirations and then channeling that through the rest of your talent management processes. So if we're looking at taking an integrated talent management approach, what do we need out of here to inform compensation, to inform succession planning, to inform any other processes that we have down the line?
I think one of the things I might add to that too, and many of you on the call or on the webinar may know this as well, is have consistently over the last few years, post-pandemic, but even pre-pandemic, but post-pandemic in particular, in always see in the top 5 drivers of employee engagement, career development or having transparency around opportunities for growth and development as a driver of the talent strategy. Based on what I just heard you say, Elaina, that's something to really be thinking about too, in terms of being able to continue to attract and retain talent.
Absolutely. Especially if you think about all the research of the newer generations in the workforce, they want clarity to expectations. If I put in X, what is Y? And how do I get where I'm looking to go? And especially in our economic climate and, with the rising cost of living, as well as inflation, as well as the cost of education, they're
Mhm.
looking not only, I think, for career growth and additional opportunities to have an impact and recognition, but also additional, potential for salary growth as well. And so I the more that we can clarify expectations, both in a current context as well as in a future context, you're going to increase the engagement of that employee and ultimately the performance and the output that you're going to get from them.
Great. Shall we move on to step number 3?
Yes, let's.
Okay.
So as we think about output, what then needs to go into performance management? What information do we have to capture in a performance review? And so I think regardless of cadence and timing, whether this is an annual eval, whether these are quarterly check-ins, whether we're in a real-time feedback model, it's really important to assess what are we capturing? What is the essence of that conversation, that evaluation, that form, that template that ultimately is a conversation? What do we really want the focus to be on? So are we doing goal setting? Are we measuring progress against goals? If we're doing a quarterly touch base, are we identifying new goals, or updating things that have changed? Well, it's really common, I think, to focus on where the employee is doing well and where they can improve. It's also an opportunity to identify and capture where and how the employee can receive additional support. So we know that we want to capture success and achievements. We know we want to capture areas for development, but there's really, I think, a missed opportunity to be able to have that conversation focused around what else do you need and how can we support you in getting it? What are the other areas where we as a leader can align closer with the needs of our employees to, again, facilitate the improvement that we want to see or facilitate the growth into a new area? And so that really, I think, improves that alignment and those expectations between the employees and managers to influence performance moving forward.
And I'll underscore, I think that I see this as incredibly critical to your point about really helping map out a plan for an employee at any level of an organization to be able to receive the experience or the skills needed to help them grow and develop for themselves, but then also help them grow and develop to be to help them reach that next level, potentially reach or strive toward that next level in the organization.
Absolutely. And we've been working with some clients who have been able to do a really good job at focusing that performance conversation on moving forward, because typically the employee and the manager are often aligned on what went well and where they're performing well, where they're meeting or exceeding expectations and what that looks like. And oftentimes are probably relatively aligned on where there might be gaps in performance or opportunity for improvement or development. But the missing piece is really goes beyond that, which is what part of your job or what part of your role on a weekly basis is difficult, is frustrating. Getting that employee perspective to be able to align additional support or resources or to diagnose some of those underlying concerns or issues that bubble up to the surface eventually as a performance problem. But being able to diagnose them early in capturing that information and having that dialogue in a little bit of a different way allows you to get ahead and to, again, increase that alignment, increase the clarity to the expectations, and move forward more productively and more quickly.
You know, you just made me think of something too. We just recorded a podcast on neurodiversity, and one of the things that our guest on that podcast spoke about is having those conversations around how a job is designed. And I think what you're saying here is in these conversations, you might be able to identify a job design issue that can be adjusted, perhaps, that would help somebody who, but for that design, is a strong performer. And because of potentially their neurodivergence, it could be impacting their ability to perform well. Just one piece, one food for thought.
Absolutely, Alison. And I think too, there's such an opportunity to redesign the conversation. We can still have, from a business perspective, all of the measuring and all of the output that we need while still changing the conversation to be able to get a better sense of, are we asking the questions that will truly uncover the information that we want to know, which is where might an employee be struggling? And are they struggling because there are factors that us as leaders, there are barriers that we can remove to support and enable them in doing their job better, quicker, more productively? Or is this a development issue and this employee is not as prepared or as confident to operate in that space? And typically, if we start with those boilerplate questions like, where do you think you can do better over the next year? That's hard to connect to. But if we ask more emotional questions, where do you get frustrated? Where do you get stuck? Those are going to be more likely to give us the information that will help us inform how to support and develop that employee moving forward.
I think that's a really great point, and I'm curious to know how many managers are really asking that question right now in that emotional way. If you think about how managers are typically have been trained to conduct performance reviews, it's not through it's to not include emotion. But I think that really strikes a chord with today's workforce and the emotional state of today's workforce, and at the end of the day, really can help an organization. Wonderful. Are we ready to move to step 4?
Yes, let's.
Okay, great.
So, whose input do you need to capture comprehensive performance? In that traditional model, it's maybe an employee self-evaluation and a manager. A lot of organizations may haven't started to include, peer reviews, which oftentimes I actually think get misbranded as 360s. But there's an opportunity to really reflect on that when we're talking about evaluating managers and leaders, which we'll get to in just a second. But we have other clients too who we've worked with to get an understanding of, if you're in a matrixed environment, as more organizations are now, especially with the shift to hybrid and virtual, if you're in a matrixed environment, oftentimes we do need additional input from other sources in order to have a comprehensive and authentic full representation of employee performance. So there's definitely an opportunity to broaden that audience. And we even have worked with multiple clients to institute a process and implement an opportunity to facilitate external feedback. So depending on the type of organization you are, if the majority of your employees are interfacing with clients or customers or partners, there are now ways that we can solicit that external feedback to help inform that comprehensive assessment of employee performance as well as employee opportunity.
And actually, we're working on a project. And I don't know if you're involved in this one, but right now, where they are looking for the highest levels of the organization, they're soliciting feedback from vendor partners, from thought partners, and from partner agencies that that group works with. So, depending on the level of the organization, I want to take a minute and talk about 360s because it's interesting in our world, and I'm sure for those of you on the call, you get to this time of year, whether you're, wrapping up last year's performance reviews, and someone will say, well, why don't we institute 360s? Maybe you already have a culture of doing 360 reviews, but you mentioned how sometimes peer review process may get confused with 360s. What do you think about 360s? What level of the organization might they be appropriate for? And how would you suggest that that information be used in the context of performance management?
That's such a great question, Allison. And I absolutely think they are underutilized for managers. In many of the clients that I've worked with, in the processes that they're coming from, managers are oftentimes assessed in the same way as employees when it comes to competencies and job expectations, but are not often assessed as thoroughly as they should in their most critical role as a manager. And subordinate feedback, I think, is the most authentic reflection of that as you can get. And there definitely is an opportunity to share that feedback upward, because as we've talked about, a manager's ability to lead and to have developmental, to have coaching conversations, to understand how to give appropriate real-time feedback, especially based on your audience, based on that relationship, is paramount to employee engagement, to retention, to productivity, to business success. And how do you measure a manager's ability to do that? It's almost intangible, but where it lives is in the perception of all of the employees who report to that leader. And so I think there absolutely is a missed opportunity in a lot of organizations to capture that feedback, to really help understand how are these managers' skills being perceived and interpreted by their subordinate employees. And that to me is more of an indicator of whether or not it's effective than if just looking at retention numbers, turnover, team productivity, and things like that. So absolutely an opportunity, and I hope that more organizations will lean into that.
Yeah, and I think it really goes back to the culture question. Does your organization have a culture of continuous feedback? Because, I feel like the resistance to 360s may be more of a cultural issue. I don't really, I've never had to hear what other people outside of my immediate team think, or my immediate team, and I may not be ready to receive that information. So just word of advice to everyone: if you're going to embark down that path of 360s, there's some change management that has to happen there, and there's some conversations about how do you receive feedback, and who receives the reports around 360 feedback. Very, very important.
I will say, Alison, too, that for a lot of clients, this is a journey depending on where you're starting from. So if you're starting from an annual review with, set competencies and a rating scale and a score for each answer and maybe a place for comments, I wouldn't be surprised if that's where your managers felt comfortable, is in assigning a number or a rating to represent performance, and they might not have those skills for real-time feedback. So getting to someplace that's much more dynamic is a huge shift and is something that can happen over a number of years. And so we are doing some 5-year strategic planning with some of our clients, because it is enormous change. And we first need to be able to get them comfortable to have a conversation and to move performance off the piece of paper and into the day and the week and the life of their relationship with that employee. And so that has to happen, you know, synchronously to some extent. If you are going to redesign a formal performance management process that is more agile and is more dynamic, and that can take time, but it's really exciting that we do have clients who are setting those goals, that where we want to be from where we are in a year, 2 years, all the way up to 5 years, because their culture is screaming for, we want that real-time feedback, but they're not ready for it. And so we're working on getting them there.
I think that's a really important point. It's not, you're doing it this way today, and tomorrow you're going to be doing it a completely different way. There's a process to get there, so you can do it in steps, is what I'm hearing you say, which is great.
Absolutely.
We did have one question around what's a matrixed organization, and I don't know if you want to address that, Elaina.
Sure. So with a matrix organization, can look a lot of different ways, but there you might have dual reporting structures. So an employee might have a formal org chart manager, but a lot of their work is supervised by another individual. So you might see this in professional services firms, where they might sit underneath a director, but they might be working collaboratively on projects. And so the project leader, who might not be their formal director, would be leading more of their day-to-day tasks and responsibilities, and so would have additional insight into that employee's performance than their formal direct on a piece of paper supervisor or manager.
Yeah, and I'm thinking we see this quite a bit in engineering firms that might have, engineers, architects, designers that are all working together on a project. And to Elena's point, they have a designated supervisor, but that person may not really work with them at all on that particular project, but they still are responsible for gathering that feedback from team members. So thanks for that. And that pulls us into our final tip number 5. Share a little bit about the metrics.
So I think there's also a huge opportunity. We're doing a lot of work in this space as well, in redesigning how are you measuring performance. So do you have holistic organizational wide competencies? Do the competencies reflect your organizational values? The competencies, are they standard for the organization? Do they vary by role and by level of role and scope of responsibility? Some organizations have that type of job defined infrastructure. Many organizations don't. And so without competencies, there are other ways to be able to consistently measure performance across the organization. A lot of organizations, I think, set goals, whether they're individual developmental goals, team goals, maybe they're cascading goals based on the leading goals of the organization all the way down to the employee level. If we are creating goals and managing goals, are we measuring goals? And how do goals translate into how are we measuring performance? If we are an organization that requires a specific output, maybe we are pay for performance, and so we need output from performance to inform compensation. How are we measuring performance in a consistent way across the organization? Many organizations use rating scales. Some organizations still use stack ranking. We've worked with some organizations recently who traditionally have used those two models and ended up running into some pretty significant cultural challenges. And so they needed to redesign away from rating scales, away from stack ranking. And we've had to work through some pretty innovative ideas. If we're not going to use a rating scale and we don't have competencies and we're not going to stack rank, so we can't compare employees to each other, what are we comparing employees to measure and quantify performance and identify top performance and differentiate levels of performance, especially if you're a pay for performance organization? So most importantly, there are so many different ways to measure performance. Step 5, from my perspective, is really going to be understanding that we're picking something that is fair and consistent, that is equitable across the organization, and that aligns with any particular output that you need.
This to me is a really loaded step, because we have seen so much transition around rating scales, use of rating scales, and stack ranking, to your point, Elaina. But I want to focus in on goals, because one of the things that I would venture to guess you see the same of when we're working with organizations is many managers are not comfortable or competent around actually crafting goals that are clear to understand and truly measurable. Can you speak a little bit about that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question, Alison?
Yeah. So with regards to goal setting, I'll reframe it a little bit, because when you were talking about the transition period to move from one type of performance management process to another, one of the things that strikes me in this one is actual goal setting. There are many organizations that are rather sophisticated, but really don't have a consistent process across an organization for setting effective goals. While some of their managers are very good at creating goals that are easy to understand and easy to and clearly measurable, many don't. And so what are your thoughts on that, and how important that is to helping managers become confident and comfortable in setting goals before launching into a goals-based performance management process?
That's such a great question. And I think that in many organizations, goal setting feels, from an employee's perspective and quite possibly from a manager's perspective, as a check the box. That here are these 3 things that I'm going to say that I'm going to do this year, and maybe I'll do them and maybe I won't, and we'll write something about it next year. So I think where I've seen goals be really successful, first is in a cascading goals model. How are goals tied to what are the goals of the organization, and how are the goals that cascade down from there, whether they are departmental goals to team level goals to employee level goals, how do they all feed the success and accomplishment and achievement of those organizational goals? The other reason why cascading goals are so effective is because they have to come from the top. So you have executive sponsorship, which means that they're probably not set once a year and not talked about or looked at until the next year, but they're measured. They're measured on an ongoing, and they're tweaked as progress is made, or a goal might be stalled or delayed, and a goal might extend from one year into the next, but they're monitored. Cascading goals are typically monitored and reported on more frequently than independent, autonomous, just individual development goals. And so that's really where I've seen that be most effective. And the organizations, I think, that do it really well, they complement. So I have my cascading business goals, but then I also have individual development goals that I partner with my manager on. And again, if we are more frequently than once a year revisiting those goals and talking about those goals, I am more likely to achieve them, and they are more likely to be meaningful and to warrant my time and investment in them. And the more that we can set achievable, meaningful goals, the easier it is to do on an ongoing basis. When they live just on that piece of paper that doesn't come out for a year, that's when it's really hard because they're not connected to anything. They're not connected to our work. They're not connected to anything that we're focusing on a weekly or a monthly or a quarterly basis. And I think that's why it's hard. It's hard to connect with them because we're not practicing how does this live within, my week, my month, my quarter, my year.
Yeah, and to that point, I've seen over the last few years organizations moving to kind of a 90-day goal review and focusing on 90-day quarterly segments, but they're calling them 90-day goals, and making adjustments, knowing that you've got your long-term annual goals that you're going to be held accountable to. But I think that shorter time span, when I think about human beings and adults, and your point about if you're not looking at it constantly and it's just words on paper, it may not have the same impact or people may lose sight. What do you think about that? I know that's more time, if you will, for a manager, but that focus on shorter cycles to do reviews and see where, not formal reviews, but check-in reviews.
I'm so glad that you brought up check-ins because I think check-ins are a great way to enhance the performance management process while still keeping it easy to do and not time consuming if we do them the right way. So for many organizations, there is already a check-in. Now, a project check-in is not the same as a performance check-in. So, but if there's already a cadence of meetings where there is a conversation, whether that's weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, one of those can easily be repurposed. They're not the same thing, but could easily be repurposed to once a month, shift that conversation beyond just the projects and the workload and the work streams to revisiting goals, to having those questions of what's working well, what's not working well, where can I support you, where are we frustrated, where are we getting stuck, those more emotional, connected to the performance and the job type questions. So we can still keep it light touch. Adding phases to a performance cycle does not inherently mean that it is more work for managers. We can design it in a way that is light touch, and we can train it so that it will be light touch because the quality of that interaction is going to be most important.
Great. We do have a question. Someone wanted to hear a little bit more about alternative rating scales. Do you have any examples you could share?
I can. So this is actually where we're going to talk about this a little bit on our next slide. If we think about cultural considerations, and Alison, if you want to go ahead, will lead us right in. But I think some organizations are trying to move away from labels and rating scales, and probably for two reasons. We inherently know that there are challenges with rating scales due to rater bias. And some organizations I also think might struggle with labels, and labels then being reflective of an employee's perception about their self or their value to the organization. And so when we think about how are we measuring performance in a way that maybe doesn't have labels or ratings, again, it goes back to designing what do we need to do to measure performance? What are we measuring against? So if we are measuring against these set categories, that's your labels and your ratings. But we don't have to measure against set categories. There are ways that we can measure across teams. There are ways that we can measure across peers. We've also designed models where we have measured to a single standard, a universal standard of excellence, a universal standard of performance across this organization. And with that type of model, you have to be really careful. It has to be set very high to be able to differentiate your top performers from everybody else. But that type of approach inherently then builds this continuum where you'll naturally see where your employees fall without that categorization of a label or a rating. So we've done some really innovative things to help design something for our clients that really fit the needs of their culture in order to be successful and adopted by their organization moving forward.
And I want to say one thing about ratings too. Just in the traditional standpoint, I see where some organizations not fall down, but maybe run into some trouble. You mentioned that there could be bias implicit in the person doing the performance review. Holding calibration sessions before a performance cycle around whatever the ratings are or the competencies that how you're going to be evaluating people regardless of your system, is something you should do every single year. It's a reminder and a level setting of putting anyone who's conducting performance reviews or anybody who's conducting self reviews of how to be thinking about the way the organization has framed their performance evaluation. And we're starting to see more organizations do that, but I'd encourage everyone on the call to be thinking about holding those sessions. They don't have to be more than an hour, but it just gets everybody on the same page and aligned across the board in a better way to be more consistent about applying any sort of rating scale.
And for some organizations, a rating scale is fine as long as it is perceived to be fair. So fairness is a huge piece here. Is there perceived equity in treatment and how that rating scale is applied? Because perceived injustice around ratings, real or not, is going to decrease the trust toward managers, and it's also going to decrease empathy toward colleagues. And it can create that sense of either competition or just lack of engagement and trust in the process as a whole. So that's a really big piece. I think there is absolutely a place in some organizations for rating scales, as long as they are applied consistently and perceived to be fair, consistent, and equitable in that treatment.
Great.
I think another really important cultural consideration is going to be training. Women are 1.4 times more likely to receive critical subjective feedback than men, as opposed to positive or critical objective feedback, which is really interesting. So I think training around unconscious bias, as well as training around giving appropriate feedback, is going to be really important. We need to train managers to have coaching conversations. The quality of that feedback is so much more important, I think, than just the timing. And if you think about timing, we think about cadence for a minute. If we're shifting from a singular annual review to a process that provides more frequent feedback, how frequent is right for your organization? What should that cadence look like? How does that align with other talent management processes or just the natural cadence of the business of your organization? We talked a little bit about if you're considering moving to a check-in model. Performance check-ins are not the same as regularly scheduled workload or project check-ins, but we can repurpose them, right? We can reconfigure. You can use that same cadence as long as we're setting the right expectations for the content of that meeting. It's important to think about the infrastructure. So if this is a large change, do we have resources to support communication, training, change management? Is this easily embedded into the technology environment that we already have? What pieces of this can be automated to facilitate the process as designed? So infrastructure, again, is going to be really important. And then if we're taking a more developmental approach, consider the career paths. So do we have a plan for how to have developmental conversations with employees about where they can go based on what opportunities exist in our organization? So if we don't have, career ladders and more than enough access to upward opportunity, how else can we provide development or mobility or advancement outside of those career ladders? What would that look like and how can we support? And something that we should absolutely plan for before launching a process that is more developmental focused. We need to make sure that we are really clear about how we can support development, again, both in current role as well as outside of current role, based on the unique structure and access to opportunity that lives within your organization.
Okay, there are two things that you said that made me think of something that I just want to underscore here. You were talking about, having the infrastructure to support the process, and many of you on the call may have technology that supports the process. Technology does not take the place of coaching conversations. So I know that it does streamline the process. It ensures that it's happening. You can see if manager A indeed gave feedback, but please don't allow that to become a crutch for managers to avoid having the conversations that can be so impactful to the trajectory of someone's career. The other thing that just came to mind, and in thinking about, if you truly want to establish a culture of feedback, it really starts at the beginning of the employee cycle. And we worked with an organization years ago that introduced us to a concept called 2x2s. And that is starting out with a new hire. It doesn't have to be a new hire. I mean, you could introduce the concept to your organizations now, but it means that on a regular basis, so think about what regular cadence could be. Maybe as a new hire, it might be more frequently than somebody who's established. So let's call it every 2 weeks. The manager requests that the employee come to a meeting with two pieces of information, one thing that's working well and one thing that could be better. And the manager also comes to the conversation with one thing that's working well and one thing that could be better. But if you have that safe place to have a conversation, know that there's an expectation that you have to share. You have to find one thing that's working well and one thing that could be better. And your managers are trained on how to receive feedback, because they may hear things that they weren't expecting, and they have to be able to thank someone for that feedback and think about what their response is going to be. But by doing that, you can create ongoing feedback loops that can feed into these performance conversations. So just two burning thoughts that had to be shared.
I love that. Thanks, Allison.
Are we ready to go to the next slide? Or you have any closing thoughts on this one?
No, let's go. Let's talk through some of our tips, takeaway
Great.
tips. All right.
So you want to lead us off, and I'll fill in. I'll add in some.
Sure. So these are our takeaway tips, our core themes from today's program. But be clear on your purpose. Understand not only what we want to get out of performance management, but also when we're thinking about everything that we're going to put into it. So what truly is our purpose? What is our North Star? And as we make all of these design decisions, are they continually aligned to that North Star when we think about our purpose for performance management and what that means to our organization? Tip number 2 is take an integrated talent management approach. So performance management does not live in a vacuum, and in a lot of organizations, it can inform so many other things in an integrated talent management life cycle. So making sure that if we're going to redesign one core process, that we're also taking into consideration the impact or the needs of some of our other integrated talent management processes, like succession planning, like career advancement, things like that. Be intentional about including voices in the process. So we talked about 360s and soliciting feedback both internally and externally from your organization. The other big thing I really want to harp on here a little bit, which we've been doing with a lot of our clients, is changing the audience of performance management. For years, performance reviews have been written to HR, to the organization. From the employee does their self-eval and they say, I did this and I want to do that. And then the manager writes them back in this third person, which just feels like justification for that rating, because it feels like you're telling somebody else about the employee as opposed to telling the employee about the employee. And so if we change the audience of performance management so that manager reviews whatever gets documented, right? Because this conversation is happening. But even if the documentation goes back to that employee and says, yes, I agree with what you said, and here's how we can improve together over the next quarter, that feels so much more authentic. And I think really increases that trust and that engagement and that investment in that conversation, that relationship, and that connectivity to the work.
You just made me think of a quote that I always that's always struck with me. People don't care what you know until you know that they care. Did I just no, something like that?
Yeah.
In other words, that emotional piece that I care about you and your development enough to have this conversation and to work together to try to help you be successful.
Mhm. One of the things we talked about, build for consistency and equity, is hugely, hugely important in performance management. Making sure that we are measuring consistently, that we are being, fair and equitable in how we evaluate, how we align expectations, how we hold people accountable, and then especially, anything that happens after performance management as a result. We often train the process, but do we spend just as much time training the skills? So I've seen this so many times, and we're really working with a lot of our clients on a whole training the process of performance management is one tiny piece. But really, when we think about, change management and rollout and deployment strategies, what are the skills that we need to have employees to train employees and most importantly managers to do, and making sure that that is our focus and that it is timely and that is an ongoing, because performance management is going to be timely and ongoing. So we need to continue to reinforce those skills long after we're done reinforcing the process.
I think planning for change management is we've spoken about it throughout the course of the conversation, but remember this is something that doesn't happen overnight. And whether it's including a communication strategy or planning for training that Elaina just spoke to, helping to prepare those who would be administering this process or those who would be engaged in this process. We have to have a change management plan in place that is that supports all of the important work that you're doing to overhaul or to just adjust your performance management process. And I know this last one, leverage executive level champions. Elaine, I know with some of the larger projects you're involved in now, and some of the newer ones that we're about to start, there are these champions at the executive level who are really helping to shape this. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think we all know that anything that comes from the top down is more likely to get implemented, adopted, and be successful in the organization. And so, with performance management being such a critical piece to employee engagement and success, any change absolutely should be sponsored from the top down. And we've been doing a lot of work with executives who are just as invested in this being successful and who have contributed to the design and who have participated in this process. And it's been invaluable, I think, to not only addressing the cultural concerns and setting the organization up for success to have their input, but also to have them hold accountability moving forward to the implementation and the ongoing adoption of performance management.
Wonderful. And that brings us to, we only have a minute or two left, but we would love to address any questions or comments that you may have. Again, if our contact info is on the last slide, which we'll share. So we certainly appreciate your time today. And if there are questions that you weren't able to ask and you want to reach out to either one of us, we would welcome that. We did have a poll we were going to share at the end. I'm not sure we have time to do that, and perhaps we could pop it up there quickly for those of you that are still on the call. We know that this program kind of gave some broad strokes of things to think about, but if there are specific areas of performance management that we alluded to that you'd like to hear more about, please let us know as we continue to think about our content for future webinars. We would be happy to do a deeper dive on any one or combination of these topics. We do these webinars to make sure that our community, our clients, those in our community have access to the information that's going to help them be more impactful in their organizations. So if you want to take a moment and just answer those. And on behalf of Elaina and I, we really do want to thank you for taking time. We know you all have plenty to be doing. And we hope that there were perhaps a few golden nuggets that you can take back to your teams as you think about how you adjust or frame or reframe your performance management tools and processes moving forward. Whitney, would you kindly show us the results of the poll? Wonderful.
Lots to
Thank
talk
you
about.
all. Lots to talk about. We've got lots more conversations to be had. So I want to thank everybody again for joining us. And we hope you have a fantastic rest of your day and week. Thank you very much.